thanks very much for introducing yourselves. I should introduce myself as well. Maurice Gleeson is my name. I'm a doctor, so started off as a psychiatrist, then went into the pharmaceutical industry, but my passion is genealogy. I started with helping my dad 8 years ago or so, just became addicted to the whole thing, and since then have gone back an extra generation on a lot of the lines in our family, and then about 5 years ago we did a DNA test. I gave it to him as a Christmas present and said, I bought it for myself initially because I was interested, and then I gave it to him. I said, give it to him as a Christmas present. He's my dad, so I will have got my Y chromosome from him. And there was a moment of could I have been switched to the hospital at the time? And it turns out that since then I've done my own DNA and we're a match. So I have received 50% of my DNA from my father. That was a big relief. And I've just become more involved with it over time. This is a picture of my family tree. It's kind of a typical Irish family tree. There's me, parents, grandparents, and so on. Timeline there on the side, and you can see that I've identified about half of my great-great-great-grandparents. The blank squares and circles are those great-great-great-grandparents that I haven't been able to identify. So I'm brick-walled with half my ancestors at about 1835 and the other half at around about 1800. And then before that, there's very, very little information because the Irish records are so lacking before that time. Because we blew them up in 1922. The first shot of the Civil War sent up this ammunition dump, which was in the Public Record Office, which had 800 years of Irish history. So that all went up in smoke. So great, great loss. Also, all the censuses from 1821 up to 1891 were destroyed. The 51, 61, 71, 61, 71, 81, 91 were destroyed by mistake. Because and some of them were pulped for the war effort in World War I, and the clerk on one side thought that the clerk on the other side had made copies, and so said, yes, go ahead and destroy them, that's fine. But they hadn't made copies. And then the earlier ones were all destroyed in the fire. So it's Irish research, you tend to hit brick walls fairly often at around about 1800 or so. Where do you tend to hit brick walls in Jamaican research?
I think where it changes to between slavery and civil records.
So that would be around about 1830 or a bit earlier?
About 1860.
1860.
Yeah, once you get to the parish records, I find excuse me, the civil registration, and then once you go to the parish records, I find it's difficult then.
I think it's difficult to match them up.
Yeah, that's it.
You might have your death records, which might show that someone was born about 1810 or 1815, but then it's actually finding them on the slave plantation.
Yeah.
Or you might find their baptism, but you won't find their parents' names attached to it.
Yeah.
So you're always like, well, is it?
And that's a problem with Irish research as well. So I've exhausted most of what I'd call the common documentary sources, such as family lore, letters, the Bible, the family Bible. The 1901 and 1911 census do survive in Ireland, and they're online and they're free, and they were brought out early because of the loss of all the genealogical records before 1900. We have Griffith's valuation in 1860, and then the cancelled books from the valuation office. So if any of your Irish ancestors were on land, you can actually trace them back to Griffith's, or from Griffith's you can trace them forward into the 1900s.
And the Massey family there.
Well, that would be, you'd have to go to the cancelled books themselves are available from the Griffiths, available online at askaboutireland.com/Griffiths.
Yeah, I saw them in 19.
And so a lot of the Irish records are freely available online. And I've got a page on my ICARA website which gives you all of the records and which particular period you should look for them. So I'll give you that information later on. Civil registration started in Ireland in 1865. Before that, church records go back to about 1800, but there's very few church records before that because there was no incentive to actually keep church records unlike in England where you can go all the way back into the 1500s or so. And then online collaboration on various online websites such as Ancestry, Genes Reunited, MyHeritage, RootsWeb, just putting your information out there and hoping you get a hit. And I'll talk about one example of that. A lot of the newspapers are coming online, and they really put the flesh on the bones of your family tree, and are really, really useful. Anyone with ancestors that lived in Dublin, they may very well be buried in Glasnevin Cemetery if they're Catholic, and that is a wonderful resource, and that can take you back into the 1700s. And they've done it up recently because, of course, we have the centenary of the 1916 uprising in a couple of years' time, and they've really improved the graveyard there, the cemetery there. There's also some electoral rolls available online, and that really was all of the documentary evidence that I came across, and then, of course, the brick wall kicks in. But what I've managed to do with DNA is I've managed to break through on this particular line and go back to the 1660s. So that was, it's patchy, but and I can tell you the story later on if we have time. But it has actually been quite successful in my particular instance. And if we have time, I can tell you the story. If not, I can give you a link to a video on YouTube where I talk about it. So, DNA has been around for a long time, but in the years between 1993 and 2003, there were huge advances made, culminating in the sequencing of the human genome in 2003. Now, that was 10 years ago. And in those last 10 years, there's been huge advances yet again. And of course, DNA is used for paternity testing, forensic evidence, crime scene investigation. You've all seen CSI, and ancient DNA. And we'll be talking a little bit about Richard II. What's involved in doing a DNA test? Here's 50 Cent doing a DNA test. He's just swabbing his cheek. With some companies, you give a little sample of saliva, ends up in a test tube, you pop it in a post, and it goes off to the lab. So it's actually very, very simple. And then 6 weeks later, you get your results. In the lab, they look at your DNA, they put it into the machine that analyzes it, your results come out and are posted onto your own personal web page with your own username, your own password, so that privacy is secured. But not only that, they compare your results with everybody else's results in their database. And the databases are getting bigger and bigger and bigger these days. And they come up with a list of your matches. These would be your genetic cousins. Okay? Now, they might be from 100 years ago, they might be from 1,000 years ago, they might be from 5,000 years ago. But those matches are posted on your webpage, and then you can contact them and say, hey, it looks like we're a close match. Can you tell me about your family tree? I'll tell you about mine. And then hopefully you can connect up that way. The other great thing, and this is mainly to do with family tree DNA, is that this particular company allows you to start projects. Sorry, yes, Colin.
How much does that cost?
I'll go through the prices later on, but you can get the cheapest one now if you like kind of dipping your toe in the water type test. €40, $49, which is what, about 35, 37 pounds. So they started off at around about $1,000, and then over the last 10 years it's come down to $99 for the autosomal DNA test. 149 for the Y DNA test, but you can get a cheap version for $49, and mitochondrial DNA, you can get the full version for $199, but you can get a cheap version for $49. So if you want to do it by degrees, kind of dip your toe in the water, see what you get, then there's, a stepwise approach is quite feasible, or you can just splash out and say, I'm going to spend my inheritance from great aunt Mabel on this DNA test. So, but we go through each of those options in due course. Now, let's take a closer look at the DNA sample that you give to the lab. It ends up in this test tube, and there you have a little bit of DNA, but the swabbing process, or just spitting into the tube, there are cells in the tube, dislodged from the inside of your cheek, and those cells contain mitochondria, which are the batteries of the cell. And those mitochondria have their own DNA. There's about 1,000 mitochondria in every human cell. And that DNA is only passed on to you from your mother. And she only got it from her mother, and her mother. mother, 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 mother. So the mitochondrial DNA is very useful for tracing your direct maternal line, your direct female line, all the way back. Okay? So we'll be looking a little bit about that. In the nucleus of the cell, you have your chromosomes. Now you have 46 chromosomes arranged into 23 pairs. So you've got 2 copies of chromosome 1, one from your father, one from your mother, 2 from chromosome 2, one from your father, one from your mother. So every chromosome, in each pair, you get 1 from your father, 1 from your mother. And the last pair number 23, are the sex chromosomes. And women have 2 XX chromosomes, and men have this much shorter Y chromosome. So you can
wouldn't like that.
Well, the interesting thing is that the X chromosome is actually much longer than the Y chromosome. So even though we get half our chromosomes from our father, half our chromosomes from our mother, in terms of total DNA, because the Y is so small, men get 51% of their DNA from their mother and 49% of their DNA from their father, because the mother gives them a little bit more with the X, father gives them a little bit less with the Y. So your average man is not as much of a person as your average woman. So that's been proved scientifically. So what can you get from a DNA test? There's a variety of different things you can get from a DNA test, and we'll go through each of these. And if you have any questions, then please just stop me along the way. These are the 4 main groups that actually do DNA testing here in Britain. You've got Family Tree DNA, and that also is the testing laboratory for the National Geographic Project, which is running the National Genographic Project, which aims to trace the migrations of humanity from its origins in Africa. You have Ancestry Dna, which is the DNA part of Ancestry.com. Many of you will be on Ancestry and be doing your research on Ancestry. You've got 23andMe, which is an American company that focuses on medical risk, but also does genealogy as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then you have Ireland's, Britain's, and Scotland's DNA, which is based up in Scotland. Alistair Moffat is associated with that, so some of you may have read about him in the papers. And there's a good comparison chart for the different companies on the ISOG website. And ISOG is ISOGG, International Society of Genetic Genealogy. And it's basically a group of us who have got together to form our own association. It's free to join, there's no fees, it's totally voluntary. And this is just passionate people who want to use DNA to advance their own family history. There are also some companies that have a specialist interest in African DNA. One of them is called African DNA, and that is a subsidiary of Family Tree DNA. And then there's another group called African Ancestry. So we'll be taking a little look at those as well. Oh, by the way, I'm recording this and I'll put it up on YouTube. I'll cut out the beginning bit where everybody introduces themselves just for privacy reasons. But if you want to actually see this afterwards, I'll send Brenda a link, and then you can view the whole presentation afterwards and have that as a resource. And I'll also put a PDF together so that you can actually click on a lot of the links. So, finding long-lost cousins. The Y DNA you get from your father, father, father. You get it, so it takes you back along that direct male line, and that has a reach of 338,000 years. So, and it was one of the, only recently, an African-American man tested, and he had a Y DNA genetic signature that was completely different from anything that had been discovered beforehand. So, and this was, he just did a commercial test, joined one of the projects, and the project administrator said, this is strange, I've never seen this before. She did some investigating. Next thing you know, we've actually jumped back an extra 200,000 years in terms of the age of the Y chromosome. So it's absolutely amazing what this technology can do. The mitochondrial DNA is on the other side of your family tree, and that traces your mother's direct male line. That has a reach of about 200,000 years. That'll take you back to Africa 200,000 years ago. Everything in between is covered by the autosomal DNA test, and the autosomes are the nuclear, the chromosomes basically. It's all the chromosomes apart from the last 2, the sex chromosomes. They're just called autosomes to differentiate themselves from the sex chromosomes. This only has a reach of about 7 generations. So another way of looking at it is that Y DNA on one side of your tree, mitochondrial DNA on the other side of your tree, will give you information about both deep and recent ancestry, but the autosomal DNA will tell you more about recent ancestry, say within the last 7 generations, 200 to 250 years. The second thing that DNA can tell you is it can tell you about your deep ancestry. So for example, here's mine. I am haplogroup R1b. So you can see that the route that my particular ancestors took out of Africa, and remember with Africa we're going back, I think modern humans first appeared about 1 million years ago, and then about 200,000 years ago they started making forays out of Africa, all of them ending in they all died out basically. So there were several forays out of Africa by modern humans. The last foray was about 60,000 years ago, and they came out of Africa, went into Arabia, went up to Turkey, and my particular ancestors turned left, others turned right, but we decided, oh, let's turn left and see what's over there. And we ended up in Spain, and then the Ice Age came down about 20,000 years ago, and they all hid in the caves, and then 16,000 years ago it all became fine again, and they came out of the caves, and they went up to Ireland, which is still connected to mainland Europe by a land bridge. No problem. So that's my particular route out of Africa. And then on the mitochondrial DNA side, I have haplogroup T2b, and this gives you an indication of where the distribution of that particular haplogroup is in Europe today. Because basically, when these people came out of Africa, the DNA, they developed mutations, little mistakes as the DNA was copied and passed on to their children, copied and passed on to their children. And over time, the mutations accumulated, so it was a bit like a paper trail, and the people that went left as they left Africa developed a completely different set of paper trails compared to those who went right. But by looking at these mutations on the chromosomes, you can tell, it kind of gives you a map of how they progressed out of Africa. So the other thing that DNA tests can tell you is your ethnic makeup. Now, I've tested with all of the companies, so here is my ethnic makeup from Family Tree DNA. I'm 100% European. With Ancestry DNA, I'm 78% from British Isles, 10% from Scandinavia, 7% from Central Europe. Okay. From Geno2, I'm 43% Northern European, 37% Mediterranean, and 19% Southwest Asian. And then with 23andMe, I'm 99.8% European, and I'm 0.1% Sub-Saharan African. So I've got a very rich ethnic makeup. I suspect that part of it is lab error or statistical error, but it could very well be that if you go back to 1,000 of my ancestors, one of them was from Africa. So it's very interesting. The important point here is that this is still quite a young science, and over time this will get more and more refined. So it will tell you a lot. I mean, I would agree that I'm 99.8% European. I think that's probably fairly spot on. But I want to find out who this ancestor is here in Africa, if he actually existed at all. So we'll talk a little bit about ethnic makeup. I'm 2.5% Neanderthal. Now, some of you might say, you don't need DNA to tell you that. And that's with Geno2. With 23andMe, it says 2.6%. And that's because modern humans, when they came out of Africa, when they got to Europe, the Neanderthals were still there. And they said, oh, look, hairy people, let's see if they want to party. And they interbred with the Neanderthals. And as a result of that, this would be the average. 2.7% maybe the average. So the average non-African would actually have 2.5% Neanderthal. Denisovan was another early hominid, pre-human, pre-modern human form, and apparently there's some remains of that as well in the genome. African people who stayed in Africa, there would have been earlier human forms there as well, and they may have well interbred with them. So the African early hominid ancestry would be quite different from the non-African European early hominid ancestry. Again, it's interesting, but I don't think it really doesn't really tell you much apart from it's interesting to talk about at dinner parties or whatever, or down the pub. The last thing you can get from DNA testing is a medical risk assessment. So with 23andMe is the company that does this, and it can tell you about your risk for Alzheimer's disease, esophageal cancer, celiac disease, alcohol dependence, hay fever. So a whole load of different medical conditions, and it'll tell you you're at increased risk, you're at decreased risk, you're at average risk. I did this, and I've got an increased risk for a variety of different things. But then when I looked at my risk for being obese and having cardiovascular disease, it was completely normal, but just huge, like 67%. So I think from a lot of this, you draw the conclusion, don't smoke, eat healthily, and take more exercise. So, but if it's something that you're interested in, then it's definitely something to consider testing with 23andMe. It'll also give you your risk for a variety of different familial conditions, including sickle cell disease, so it might be quite useful to test and see if you've got the sickle cell trait. And finally, you join a community of avid genealogists. So members of the International Society of Genetic Genealogy have come together, and their aim is to support everybody else in the community. Totally free, like I say, excellent website, excellent wiki pages, lots of information, and they have a DNA newbie mailing list where you can ask any question you want about DNA and not feel silly about it. Okay, so very, very supportive community. Now, let's apply some of this to actually Caribbean ancestry. And there's three things I'm going to talk about: ethnic makeup, deep ancestry in the direct male line, and deep ancestry in the direct female line. But it does carry a warning that the science is evolving all the time. It's still in the early stages, and certainly the next 5 to 10 years are going to see huge leaps. So if you start small now, be guaranteed that in 5 or 10 years' time, prices are coming down all the time as well, but in 5 or 10 years' time, you're going to know a huge amount about your genetic ancestry that you never even imagined was possible. So let's first look at the ethnic makeup. And this is the ethnic makeup of an average African-American man, and is taken from a website called The Root, which is run by Professor Henry Louis Gates. Has anybody heard about him? Right, we'll talk a little bit about him later on. He's an absolutely fantastic guy. So the average African-American will have, their DNA makeup will be somewhere between 65 to 80% African, 19 to 29% European, and 0.6 to 2% Native American. Okay, so that's African American. Now, Afro-Caribbean people, and it's probably going to vary from island to island as well, they will have something similar, but it is going to be quite variable depending on which Caribbean island you go to. The other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of this research still needs to be done. So it's going to very much depend on people like your good selves doing the DNA testing to actually find out what is the genetic signature of the different Caribbean islands. But this is based on 78,000 people in the 23andMe database, as well as the other databases as well, to give you these ranges. And some of these, the inner circle breaks it down into African, European, and Native American. And then the European can be broken further into Southern European, Northern European, and that can be broken further into Italian and Iberian. And then on the Northern European side, that can be broken down further into British and Irish, French and German. Now, this wouldn't have been possible a couple of years ago, but what's going to happen, what is happening and what's going to continue happening is that these subgroups are going to get smaller and smaller and smaller, and we will eventually, and as is happening certainly in Ireland, we will eventually be able to link up with the ancient tribes in Ireland. And there's absolutely no reason why we can't do that in Africa as well. So in the next 5 to 10 years, DNA tests will actually tell you what tribe or what clan your DNA actually came from, which I think is really, really exciting. Now, in terms of your Y DNA, we've seen that, say, 80% of the DNA will be African, say your average African American, and somewhere about 20% of it will, or 15% will be European. The most common European genetic signatures are OR1b, which accounts for 80% of the population. You can see around here that in Ireland and Scotland, OR1b is the most frequent genetic signature. Also, I1 is very common in England, about 15% of the population, and probably is of Viking origin. So if you do have Y DNA that goes back to Europe, it's probably going to be OR1b or I1. However, if you have a Y DNA that comes from an African line, it will either be haplogroup A, A1, A2, A3, haplogroup B, which is round about here in Central Africa, or most commonly in West Africa, E1, B1A. And this is Bantu and West African. So if you were to do a Y DNA test, you'd probably get one of 5 results. First result would be 2 European choices, OR1b or I1. Second result could be African, A, B, or E1, B1A. So that's that. So just doing a simple and even the basic test, the 12 marker test, which costs $49, that would be enough to tell you 90% of the time, 99% of the time, what haplogroup, what genetic signature you carry. And that would tell you whether your father's line was from a European man or from an African man. So that would be deep ancestry on the paternal side. On the maternal side, here are the common haplogroups in Africa, L1, L2, L3, and you can see the common haplogroups in Europe, H and T and I. So again, totally different haplogroups. So just doing a basic mitochondrial DNA test would tell you whether your mother's line came from Africa or came from Europe. So very useful. Here's a chap, Professor Henry Louis Gates. I was going to ask you, does anyone recognize him? But then I've written his name here, so that would be cheating, really, wouldn't it? He was unfortunate because he did his Y DNA testing and he did his mitochondrial DNA testing. They both came back as being European. So on his Y DNA, he has a European genetic signature that matches Niall of the Nine Hostages in Ireland. And he was this warlord back about 500 AD. So Professor Henry Louis Gates is descended from one of Niall of the Nine Hostages' family, going back to Ireland about 500 AD. We don't know all the different points along the way, but that's what the current evidence is saying. And like I say, in the next 5 to 10 years, this will be refined even further and further. So we might even be able to tell what clan or tribe they came from about 1,000, 2,000 years ago. Also, he found out that his mitochondrial DNA was European. So even though he considers himself African, the DNA testing he did on both these arms indicated a European source for his father's ancestor and his mother's ancestor. He's got an excellent website called The Root. And he also has Finding Your Roots, which is a television series. It's available on cable public. It's PBS from the States, but absolutely fantastic, absolutely fantastic. And he is applying DNA now to his genealogy in a way which is refreshing and I think quite revolutionary as well. So if you do get a chance to see his television series, definitely give them a look. Now, this is also from one of his websites. And I heard him speak in Los Angeles in June. And he presented a map that was very, very similar to this. And he got together a whole load of experts and scholars to bring together from various different places the documentary evidence about the transatlantic slave trade. And what he was able to do was, for the first time, get an overall picture of who came from where and where did they go to. And 5 million people went to the Caribbean, 5 million people went to South America, 300,000 went directly to North America. Very, very low figure, really. But a lot of the people went to America, went via the Caribbean. So that's an interesting, because that has interesting implications from a DNA perspective as well. But he also produced these maps which compares the people that were shipped from Africa to the Caribbean and the people that were shipped directly from Africa to North America. So of particular interest to this group will be the first map here. And you can see that 20% came from Nigeria, 15% from Benin, 20% from Ghana, 26% from Angola, so that's the highest proportion. And then there's smaller proportions from Senegambia, Ivory Coast, and Mozambique. So we even had some from East Africa, Southeast Africa. if you compare that with the North African or North American origins of the people that were transported, you see that Senegambia has a much higher percentage, 23.6%. Sierra Leone also has a higher percentage as well, 11.6 compared to 3.9. And the other ones are more or less the same. But very few people from Benin went to America. Oops. What happened there? Oh, is it Solihull Libraries trying to do something? Well, let's close that and bring that up again. So that'll come up now in a second. Right. So, and again, the importance from a genetic point of view is that he has actually helped us locate where in Africa we should be doing our DNA testing so that we can build up our database. You know, if we compare ourselves to people who are living in these places today, and you do have to be aware of that Bantu migrations may mean that the people that are living there today are not the same people that were living there 1,000 years ago, but you can make some indirect comparisons. But this type of documentary research has allowed us to pinpoint where in Africa we need to be sampling individuals so we can compare them to the people in the Caribbean and in North America. Who has seen the Motherland documentary? Okay, this was a documentary done in 2003. They took about 220 people from the UK, they swabbed them, and at this stage they were only looking at 5 markers on the mitochondrial DNA and 9 markers on the Y DNA. Now we have 300 STR markers and we have 1,000 of SNP markers on the Y DNA. So we've really progressed since then. But back in 2003, they produced this documentary, and I don't think I have an internet connection, but I am going to see if I can connect to it. And it might take a few minutes, and it might not work. If it doesn't work, that's fine. But like I said, this is freely available on YouTube, and it's well worth watching because particularly this one here, Beulah's reunion, because they took them back to Africa and reunited them with people who were a genetic match. Now, they've been criticized that maybe it was too soon and that the number of markers they were using was too small, but to be actually reconnected with people that you are definitely genetically related to, that you might not have, that the family hasn't seen for 500, 600 years, is very, very powerful. And this is one of the reasons why I actually set up the Irish Caribbean Project, because of the power of reconnecting people with their ancestral homeland. We talked about costs. The costs for African DNA are, there we go. And they're rather expensive, $189, $289.
Is this American dollars?
It's American dollars, yeah.
It's not Jamaican dollars.
But you need to know, don't you?
No, it's true, it's true. I wish it was Jamaican dollars. Or maybe Trinidad and Tobago dollars, it'd be nicer still. Yeah, this is American dollars, and it's still relatively...
I was going to ask,
Sure.
what are you doing then for DNA testing itself in
What-
Europe? What is Europe doing? Because this is very much American.
This is this is global,
Yes.
but the Americans are the leaders.
Yes.
And you'll find in this one here. This would be the one that is most widely used, family tree DNA, for genealogical purposes. 23andMe, 80% of the people are more interested in the medical risk assessment. And if you contact a lot of your matches on 23andMe, they don't bother replying because they're no interest in family tree whatsoever. So family tree DNA is what most people would use, and the prices have come down, so you can get your cheapest Y-DNA 12-marker test for $49, 37 would be $149, your cheapest mitochondrial DNA for $49, and a full mitochondrial sequence for $199, and your cheapest autosomal DNA for $99 as well, and that's pretty good value.
It's not saying about what Europe, I mean, are they doing any sort of research and DNA thoughts?
Well, there is Ireland's DNA, Britain's DNA, Scotland's DNA, and they have their own particular approach. It's, at the end of the day, this is a global exercise because, and I think the database that we want to develop is a global database because so many people now have different ethnic mixtures, that we need to have an accurate way of saying this person is from there, this person is from there. Having said that, going back to my previous slide, this chap here, African Ancestry, they claim that they have the largest African database. So if you were very interested in finding out about your deep ancestry in Africa, then these would probably be the best people to test with. But again,
Are they from America?
they're American, yeah. And you'll see Dr. Rick Kittles in a lot of the television programs.
Yeah.
Henry Louis Gates wheels him out and he says something and he wheels him back in again. And he's great. He's a really, really great guy. And he's done a lot of good work. What he said himself was that what DNA has allowed people of African descent to see is that the door that was firmly closed previously, they're still trying to connect me. I'm going to close that down. The door that was previously closed firmly tight is now beginning to open, and there's a chink of light coming in, and over the next 5 to 10 years that's just going to get bigger and brighter. So hopefully some of these prices will come down though as well, because they've been up at that point for quite some time. So you could test with African DNA, which is a subsidiary of family tree DNA, but the reason why it's more expensive is that they have two genealogists there that give you a specific interpretation from an African viewpoint. So they take into account all the documentary evidence of the Bantu migrations in Africa, and they look at your DNA and they say, okay, in all likelihood, the best estimate that we can give you for the location of your African ancestral tribe on your direct Y line or on your mitochondrial DNA is here. So they will do that kind of assessment, and it'll cost $189 on your father's father's father line, another $189 on your mother's 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 line, and if you want to look at all the other chromosomes in between, it'll cost $289. It seems a bit much, and I'm not sure I could recommend that really. What I might be inclined to do is just dip your toe in the water, do a cheap test, and then join one of the free projects on Family Tree DNA once you get your results. There's an African DNA project that is run by Dr. Anna, which is very big, and these are people who are experts, volunteers, and they're doing a lot of this, what's called citizen science. There's the Caribbean Y DNA project, and there's also my Irish Caribbean Y project, which is aimed at people with Irish surnames trying to reconnect with their ancestral homeland on the Irish side, and possibly with distant cousins as well who might still be living in Ireland today. So,
Sorry, can you just stop
sure.
that again?
So that's how DNA can help with deep ancestry and kind of giving it a particular Caribbean spin. Okay. Now let's look at, and that's going back deep, thousands of years. Let's look at more recent ancestry now and how DNA can be used for recent ancestry. There's two approaches. It's either a fishing trip or asking a specific question. If you go on a fishing trip, you take the test, you throw your results into the database, and you see what you can catch. A specific question is usually along the lines of, I'm sure we're related to that crowd over there, and they have money. So they're two very, very different questions. You know, this is a Sunday afternoon fishing. This is you know, let's see if we can get in with that crowd. Of course, if you have a specific question, it probably means that you and the other person have to take the test, and that applies to this gentleman here, and it probably applies to you as well. You know, that you'd actually have to test two people to see if there was a genetic connection. And there are three types of DNA tests that we can use for this recent ancestry research. The Y-DNA looks at the direct male line, and if I move it out there, if I just look at the Y-DNA, it will connect me with anybody who has a common male ancestor, a direct male ancestor up, direct male ancestor down. So I'm looking for, that would actually connect me with any of my Gleeson ancestors. So anybody with a Gleeson surname, it would allow me to connect with them going all the way back, and I could go back to 338,000 years ago. Of course, they wouldn't have been called Gleesons then. The Gleeson name probably only came in around about 1,000 years ago. So that would be on the recent side. But to illustrate how Y-DNA is used, I'll tell you the story about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Now, this is an example of applying Y-DNA to a specific question. Thomas Jefferson, one of the early presidents of the United States, and for years there was this controversy about Jefferson fathering his slave's last child, and it literally 200 years raged in the papers, and he denied it, and then finally in November 1998, this paper was published in Nature, which put the controversy to rest. Now, President Thomas Jefferson, he had a plantation in Monticello, and Sally Hemings was one of the slaves on his plantation, and she was a very attractive young teenager when she started working for the Jeffersons as a kind of a housemaid, and she looked after the children, and she went to Paris with the children when Jefferson was doing his French trip, and she had, I think, around about 7 or 8 children altogether. Thomas Woodson was the first of her children. Eston Hemings was the youngest, and she had 6 in between. So President Thomas Jefferson had children of his own, but he doesn't have any direct male lines. There were no direct male line descendants, so his line daughtered out. There's no Jefferson male descendants. He also had a sister who married a chap called Carr and had 2 nephews, Samuel Carr and Peter Carr. And some people would claim it wasn't Jefferson who was the father of Sally Hemings' children, it was actually one of the Carr brothers. Now the problem was, because Jefferson didn't have any direct male line descendants, the researchers had to go back up to his father and then to his grandfather and to trace their descendants down. Now, of course, Jefferson would have got his Y-DNA from his father, and he would have got it from his father, and then he would have passed it on to all his direct male line descendants. Father, father, father up, son, 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 son down. Okay? So they found 5 living descendants of Thomas Jefferson's grandfather, Thomas Jefferson II. They also found living descendants of the Carrs. They had to again go up on the Y line to come down on the Y line. They found descendants of Thomas Woodson, and they found one direct male line descendant of Eston Hemings. So they tested all of them, and the results came back, and what they found was that all 5 of Thomas Jefferson's direct male line descendants had the same genetic signature, indicating they had received the same Y chromosome, all 5 of them, along each of the lines, and there wasn't a break in transmission of this Y DNA. On the Carr side, they had a completely different genetic signature to the Jefferson Y DNA, but they were all the same. There was a minor mutation, a 2-step mutation in one person, but you could say just by looking at the genetic signature, these people are all related to each other. They've all received Carr Y DNA. The question was, were Sally Hemings' sons going to have Carr Y DNA or Jefferson Y DNA? Well, they looked at Thomas Woodson's descendants, and none of them had a genetic signature that matched the Carr genetic signature or the Jefferson genetic signature. In fact, 4 of them were the same, and one of them was completely different. We'll come back to that. Then they looked at Eston Hemings' descendant, and his was a match for the Jefferson Y DNA. So it went to a panel of experts, and they concluded that it was highly improbable that one of the Carrs was the father to any of Sally Hemings' children. So these two nephews were ruled out. It was highly improbable that Thomas Woodson's father was a Jefferson or a Carr. This chap here, Thomas Woodson's father, whoever he was. They thought it was highly probable that Jefferson fathered Eston Hemings and all 6 of Sally Hemings' later children. That was the first expert. That was the first expert panel. The second expert panel said, well, no, hold on, it could have been his brother, because his brother would have had the same Y DNA. Yeah? So, even when you have the DNA evidence is not 100% proof. It's maybe 90%, 95%, 99%, 99.9%, but nothing in genealogy, as you all know, is 100% definite. Okay? Because you could have been switched to the hospital, in your babies. So this was a nice way of illustrating why DNA can be used to address a very specific question. And this is 1998, so they were only using 5 or 6 markers. But even then, it was sufficient to be able to make these kind of conclusions. This is an interesting one here. This blue one, this blue square, is called an NPE, a non-paternity event. Also known as not the parent expected. So yes. I thought it meant a virgin birth initially, but that's just my Catholic background. So something went, the transmission was broken here in this particular line. You can see that Thomas Woodson passed it down to his son, and then his descendants here, they're all brown, so these are all fine, but there's a break between this person here and this person here, and either there was not the parent expected at this point when this transmission occurred, or at this point when this transmission occurred. So, and this is something that you'll see. Now, this is probably an out of wedlock child, but you go back in history, and it could be fostering, it could be adoption, and certainly in Ireland, children were given away. I'm talking about thousands of years ago, not even maybe 500 years ago. Children were given away to friends of the family. Oh, you don't have any children? Would you like one of ours? That sort of thing happens.
Isn't there any pictures to sort of
of Sally?
Well, no,
I mean, the
pictures
features.
of the president.
Oh,
Right.
yes.
Because I find that with black people, sometimes you can trace back. You might not look like your uncle or your great uncle or your.
Mm-hmm.
There is something there that you can say, you look like this part of the family.
It is very interesting that happens. But there are no pictures of Sally Hemings, so we don't actually know what she looks like, which is really sad. We know that she was a beautiful woman, and that's why Jefferson was presumably attracted to her. But we don't actually have any pictures of her. The interesting thing is that she was quite light-skinned, and her children were quite light-skinned, apart from Thomas Woodson, I think, who was quite dark-skinned. Eston Hemmings passed into white society. So that's, using that euphemism from the time. And that's what happened with a lot of people back then. I would know. I don't, not that I'm aware of. I certainly haven't found any.
It's interesting too, because I was intrigued to hear about J. Hoover as well.
Oh, right.
He's a, the archaeologist. There's a brilliant documentary about him, how he passed. But there was a lot of secrecy for him to stay past.
Yeah.
And deaths.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because the next point I was going to make is that they looked at 78,000 people in the database of 23andMe who considered themselves white Americans, and 4% of them have a hidden African ancestry. So 4% of people who would consider themselves as white American have got somebody in their past who passed for white, and they have an African ancestor in their past, which is very interesting. And there's if you look online, you'll actually find some of these blogs and posts about people have actually found that they are descended from Thomas Jefferson, and they've gone to the plantation, and one guy went with his daughter, and his daughter walked in, she fainted immediately. So maybe there's some kind of genetic memory. It's all a little bit spooky.
I've had the opposite problem. I mean, my mum's English and my father's Jamaican, and I'm one of 5 children. The other 4 children are dark, and I was born this colour. So I've spent 50 odd years trying to say, this is my dad.
Yeah.
Right, and I'm getting there, right? And I've got some of his features, and the funny thing is, I've got 3 sons, and they've all got Jamaican in them.
Yeah.
Yeah, right from an early age, when they used to go to school, people used to say, what nationality is your husband? I said, it's not my husband, it's my dad. Right, there's things like that.
That's amazing.
But now I found out about, I knew a little bit about the massive connection, and that he was like Irish descent, like my dad's dad, right, and his mum was Jamaican, right. So I've always assumed that I've took the Irish look because I've got the green eyes.
Yeah.
So I'm just assuming, like, that's what's happened.
If you did the DNA
Yeah, that's
ethnic
why
makeup.
That's why I'm really interested in
Yeah.
this. I thought, like, just to prove
Yeah, well,
once and all.
it will answer some questions,
Yeah.
and it will open up a whole load of
yeah.
new questions that you never anticipated.
Yeah,
You know.
that's it.
So
Yeah, that's right.
another application of Y DNA is a project that I've set up myself because I just happened to be interested in it. My brick wall took me back to the 1660s, so I looked at the history, because normally, you got a brick wall and you look at the 1800s, and so it's fascinating, and you don't really know much about the 1700s or the 1600s. But mine took me back to the 1600s, and I thought, oh great, wonderful opportunity to explore the local history. As a result, I discovered that Cromwell, between 1652 and 1657, as he rampaged around Ireland, he rounded up a load of women and children, took them to Cork, shipped them across to Bristol, and then moved them across to Barbados and some of the new American colonies, where they were slaves. Now, according to O'Callaghan, in his book, and this might be of interest to some of you, but that was the book that he did, To Hell or Barbados. Now, he's a journalist, so unfortunately it's not referenced, and people have questioned his sources. But he maintains that somewhere between 50,000 and 130,000 men, women, and children were sent over to Barbados and the new American colonies, and Ireland's population at the time was only 1.5 million. So that number represents somewhere between 4% and 15% of the total population, which is why he's actually subtitled his book "The Ethnic Cleansing of Ireland." There was how much of this is true is difficult to know. But one of the reasons I set up the project was to go a little bit deeper and to see just exactly how much of this is true. And the idea behind it is to find out where are the Irish in the Caribbean today. Now, not all of the Irish would have been slaves. Some of them would have been indentured servants in the 1630s and 40s, where they volunteered for 7 years' labour, and then they'd get some land in Barbados. That didn't turn out because all the land was used up. So a lot of them ended up going to Jamaica, with the British military, where they kicked out the Spanish, and a lot of the early Irish ended up in Jamaica that way. Still, other Irish were religious refugees, and they ended up in Montserrat, and others just were oppressors rather than oppressed, and they took advantage of the slave trade, and they came over and they owned plantations, and they were just as bad as any of the other plantation owners.
See my name.
You can?
Oh.
Let me change that.
She's electric pen and not.
Oh, really? So there's a whole load of Irish names in the Caribbean today, and so I've set up this project to see if we can use DNA testing to help people. It stands for Irish Caribbean Ancestry Reconnecting Through DNA, and the idea is that somewhere back in the 1600s there's a common ancestor. Some of his offspring, his children, survived and maybe still do today.
You pinch my surname.
There you go, Ryan.
Yeah,
There you go.
because my husband's family was Irish.
All right, and so there's Ryans in your family.
Yeah.
So, and some of those Ryans might have ended up in Jamaica and might be living there today, while some of the Ryans still are living in Ireland. But with Y-DNA testing, you should be able to see whether you actually match them. So, just like we did for Barack Obama, we can welcome the people back and say, yes, you're Irish, have a pint and spend some money or in recession. So, so that's the idea behind ICARA. And there's a group called Ireland Reaching Out who have volunteers all over Ireland who are trying to do backwards genealogy, find out where people went and then contact their descendants and invite them back. So this is very much going to work in tandem with Ireland Reaching Out. Now, what we can do afterwards, if we do get an internet connection, is we can go onto the Family Tree DNA website. We can, if we don't manage to do this, you can do it at home. You can search for your name on the home page, and that will tell you, and here I am searching for my Spearin name. Spearin is one of my names. There are 6 Spearins in the database, and there's a Spearin surname project with 34 members. So if you're interested in doing a DNA test, then you can go to Family Tree DNA and do some background research and see what you find. Now, the other thing you do, apart from joining a surname group, is you can join haplogroup and geographic projects. Because, like I say, they're finding new markers all the time. The branches of the human genetic tree are getting finer and finer and finer. And in the next couple of years, we will be able to hook up with individual tribes and clans from the ancient histories and mythologies. So haplogroup projects, there's a variety of them there for Ireland, and there's a variety of them there for Africa. And geographical projects, there's a variety of Irish geographical projects, and there's a variety of African, Caribbean, and of course my own Irish Caribbean Y project there. That's the ICARA project there. So the great thing about this is that your DNA research does not stop with the test. It does not stop with the results. It continues on an ongoing basis. As they discover new markers, maybe you want to be tested for that marker to see if you belong to that particular subgroup or the subgroup of the subgroup. And finally getting down to the tribes and the clans. And the same applies to Scotland as well. So is a Y-DNA test the best test for you? You can only do it if you're a man, obviously. Women, you'll have to find a man, get him to do the test, and get your Y-DNA information that way. It's good for deep ancestry and for telling you what haplogroup you belong to. Sorry, Sharon.
My question is, I'm one of 5 girls, so obviously I haven't got a brother. So would I have to use like a cousin?
Yeah.
Use a cousin.
A cousin bearing the name that you're interested in researching. So if you want
so if it's a cousin with the same grandparents, I could use.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you
But,
use your own child?
No, because your son will have got his Y-DNA from your husband.
Oh, right.
You know, if you want to go to your father, and this is for you as well, if you want to find out your father's line, you'll have to go back up to, past your father to his father, and then a direct male line down from your grandfather. Because say if your uncle has your father's name, yes. Because like there's no point in taking an uncle on your mother's side. Your father, absolutely. Yeah. Father, brother, or male cousins with the same surname that you're interested in. Okay. There are over 7,000 surname projects on Family Tree DNA. There are also quite a lot of geographic projects, quite a lot of haplogroup projects which will advise you on further testing, because it usually isn't just one test and that's it. They're discovering new things all the time. So, but Family Tree DNA lets you do it relatively cheaply, because a SNP test I think costs $39, whereas if you were to do the whole thing, it would cost you maybe $200 or $300.
How long does it take for it to come back?
About 6 to 8 weeks. Relatively quick.
So they email you the results back, or?
They will, as soon as they get your results in the lab, they'll send you an email saying, "Oh, we just got your test. Here's a username and a password for your own website. Okay, why don't you go there now? We've set it up for you. Put in your personal details, put in your email address, put in some of your genealogy information. Who was your most distant known ancestor on your father's 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 line, on your mother's 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 line. You know, maybe you can even upload a GEDCOM and put your tree up there as well. Okay, put in a list of your ancestral surnames, just like we shared at the beginning. So there's a lot you can do while you're waiting for your results. Then your results come through and say, here are your results. Here are your 250 matches. Here are your 250 genetic cousins. Some of them very close, some of them thousands of years ago. So.
People never come back and say sorry.
Very rarely, yes. If you have a particular genetic signature that is relatively rare, they'll come back and they'll say, no matches in the database so far. So if it's a fishing trip, you just have to wait for a bite. As more fish jump into the database, hopefully one of them will actually bite.
Start testing them.
I'm just thinking, if you do the testing now, and this technological advance in the next 10 years or so, you don't have to do it again, or can they use the original?
With Family Tree DNA, they'll keep the original sample, and they just use the sample until they've used up all the DNA.
So if you can grab them now, do it now.
Do it now. Do it now, because you don't know when people are, how long they're going to be around for.
Sure.
So, you know, and there are a number of stories about people having their father test, and he was the last in the line, and they got lots of information that they would have missed if they'd waited for a year, for example. So that's Y DNA. So we focused just on the father's line up till now, but let's take a quick look at mitochondrial DNA. And this is Richard III, the king in the car park.
Yeah.
The Hunchback King.
Yeah, I'm reading the book at the moment.
This is the one that Shakespeare does, now is the winter of all discontent, and he's
Yeah.
doing all that kind of stuff. He was killed at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485 and buried in Greyfriars Abbey. And this is a plaque in, I think it's the Leicester Cathedral. But Philippa Langley but they never found his body. Philippa Langley of the Richard III Society raised money using Kickstarter and Indiegogo to actually, no, it was from the actual society itself. They raised tens of thousands of pounds and said to an archaeologist, "We think we know where he's buried. Can you dig him up?" And he said, "Okay, I'll take your money, but I'm not promising anything." And they had found old maps of Greyfriars Abbey. There it is there. And they superimposed that on Google Maps or current maps, and it's in Leicester Social Services car park. So they went to Leicester Social Services and said, "Can we please dig up your car park? We're looking for King Richard III." And the archaeologists behind them were going. So they said, "Sure, And on the first day of the dig, they found a hunchback skeleton. And they did some further testing, and some further evidence emerged. He had very nasty injuries on his skull, as if somebody had driven a pike into it, or somebody had slashed it with a sword. There was also a humiliation injury on his pelvis, where somebody had rammed a sword. They looked at his diet. They looked at his bones. They found a living descendant on Richard III's maternal line, mother line. And he was the last in the line to receive mitochondrial DNA. He agreed to have a DNA test, so he swabbed, and there's Tory King from the University of Leicester applying the test. And it came back that his mitochondrial DNA was a direct match for the DNA that they managed to extract from the tooth of the skeleton, indicating beyond reasonable doubt that this chap here, Michael Ibsen, was related to Richard III because Richard III got his mitochondrial DNA from his mother, Cecily Neville, Duchess of York, and she passed it on to her daughter, and then Anne of York, then Anne, Catherine, Barbara, Margaret, Barbara, Barbara.
Yeah, I know.
So you've got a cousin called Barbara.
Anne, Charlotte, Muriel, Joy, and then finally Michael. Now, Michael would not pass mitochondrial DNA onto his children. His sisters would continue passing it down. So mitochondrial DNA always stops with the male. It only can be passed through the female. So that's why it's mother. So taking it all together, the totality of the evidence suggests that the body that they found is Richard III. So what they're going to do now is they're going to give him a royal burial in Leicester Cathedral. Yes. Oh, no, you're not. Oh, yes, we are. Oh, no, you're not. War of the Roses all over again. So there'll be fun and games there. So is a mitochondrial DNA test the best test for you? It's useful for confirming a relationship between two people on their direct female lines, okay? But that's about it, really. It's also useful for deep ancestry, so going back to Africa thousands of years ago, very, very useful for that as well. We don't really use it very, very much in recent ancestry, in recent family tree research. This is the test that we do use most frequently, and this is the Autosomal DNA test. And this looks at about 7 generations back. So it'll connect you with distant cousins with whom you share a common ancestor, probably within the last 200 to 250 years. It will answer questions like, are we really second cousins? Are we really first cousins once removed? So it is a very, very useful test for looking at all of your family tree. Now, I've done it, so I can reach back to about 1765 with this particular test. But I got my dad to do it, and he's an extra generation, and I got my aunt to do it. So we can get back theoretically to about 1695, 1700. And to illustrate how it can be used, and this will be very, relevant to this lady here and this gentleman here. I'll tell you the story about the mystery of the wedding memento, which is a story from my own family, and the story of Ruby Kathleen Gleeson. Now, this fell out of my dad's grandfather's papers as he was leafing through them a couple of years ago, and he thought it was a bookmark, so he picked it up, and it turned out to be a wedding memento. And this wedding was between David Patterson and Ruby K. Gleeson. David Patterson, Ruby K. Gleeson, married at Targo Minda, the 23rd of March, 1893. So we spoke to my dad's first cousin, and she said, no, we wouldn't have anybody called Ruby in the family. She sounds like a table dancer.
Ruby's gone to town.
So, you know, we don't know. She's not one of ours. Put her in the shoebox, shove her under the bed, forget her. So poor old Ruby was at risk of being relegated to the shoebox of obscurity. And I thought, no, I'm going to cling on. I'm going to see exactly if we can find out anything. So I first started off by saying, well, where the hell is Targaminda? And it turns out that it's in the middle of the Australian desert, surrounded by man-eating koalas, murderers, poisonous snakes, giant rats, dingoes, shacks with frickin' lasers. That's my favourite. And teetering on the brink of nothing. So what was a wedding memento from a wedding that happened on the far side of the world doing in my dad's grandfather's papers? Well, I wrote off to Australia and I found her marriage certificate. And her parents were John and Anne Gleeson. I thought, fantastic, because my great-great-grandparents were John and Anne Gleeson. Were they the same John and Anne Gleeson? Well, Anne Gleeson had a brother called John Gleeson, and they had a sister called Catherine Gleeson who married a John Gleeson. So there were 3 John Gleesons in the same family, and 2 Gleesons marrying to each other. So, okay, I wasn't going to say this is definite proof at all. But she was born in Longstone, and I thought, well, that's a coincidence, because all of my great-grandfather's siblings were born in Longstone, or the surrounding townlands. The marriage certificate had him as a hotel keeper. No, there's no way. He never set foot in a hotel, ever. And then on the death certificate, he was described as a farmer. I thought, well, that's more likely. Maybe she lied about him being a hotel keeper because her future husband was a hotel keeper, and he wanted somebody with experience. So there might have been a little bit of a porky pie there. John Gleeson, well, she was born about 1872, 1869, as indeed were the siblings of my great-grandfather. So that was quite consistent. She apparently went to Australia in 1886, according to what I discovered later on, and that corresponded with a date of death for my great-great-grandfather, 1885. The patriarch dies, the family split up and have to move everywhere. We also had a family lore of 2 of the siblings of my great-grandfather going to Australia, Winifred and Timothy, and Winifred was supposed to have a daughter who was a concert pianist or a singer of some sort, and was quite famous. So I put all of this information up on Genes Reunited, and then waited for 2 years, and got a match. And I was able to then trace the living descendant of Ruby Kathleen Gleeson. I found her grandson, Alan, who was in his 80s. And we struck up an email conversation. And I said, you know, what do you know about Ruby Kathleen? He said, well, she came over with an uncle and aunt and frequently went to visit them in Sydney. One day by pony, the next one by pony and trap, and then the train. So it took a 2-day journey to Sydney. She also had a brother who went off to the US and became a baseball player. Oh, and he sent us a watch with an engraving on the back. What did the engraving say? We can't find the watch. But Ruby Kathleen also had a daughter who was an accomplished musician and excelled at the violin. Again, an interesting parallel between the 2 family lores, but there was nothing that you could say this is definite proof. So Alan agreed to do a DNA test, and I sent him the test in Australia, and if Ruby Kathleen, there's her picture there, and my great-grandfather Martin were siblings, as the documentary evidence seemed to suggest, you would expect siblings to share about 50% of their DNA in common, and there's the range, 40 to 57%. First cousins would share about 12.5%, second cousins 3.125%, and second cousins once removed, that would be my relationship with Alan, about 1.5%. So we were looking for Alan and Dad to share about 3% of their DNA in common. The results came back 2.6%, well within the range that you'd expect for second cousins. And the results came back and said, we predict that you're actually second cousins. And mine was 1.5%, again, bang on, right in the middle of what you'd expect. So what the autosomal DNA testing has told us is that Dad and Alan are definitely genetically related, and the best fit, according to their statistics, is second cousins, which is exactly what we'd expect from the documentary evidence. So it has confirmed a suspected relationship with 99% probability, but it has left many questions unanswered. And that's the thing about DNA. It helps focus your research. It doesn't answer all the questions, but it helps focus your research, answers a few questions, and then gives you 10 more. You know? Questions like, which of the sisters became Ruby Kathleen? Was it Winifred? Was it Catherine? Was it Bridget? Was there another sister called Ruby Kathleen? But she has been saved from the shoebox of obscurity, whereas we would have shoved her under the bed a couple of years ago. Now we're saying we still need to keep on searching on this particular line, which is really, really good that she has been saved from that fate. We have new cousins in Australia, vice versa. So that's what autosomal DNA has told us in this particular situation. And that's an example of autosomal DNA being used to answer a specific question. Now, in terms of the fishing trip, and these are my last set of slides, and I'll run through them fairly quickly. If you do the autosomal DNA test and just kind of put your data out there in the database and see what you catch, there's various companies you can test with. Family Tree and DNA will probably offer the most support. 23andMe, if you test with them, you get your medical risk assessment as well. Ancestry DNA, it gives you access to all of their trees. So, you know, it's in the ideal world, just test with all three of them. But, you know, if you just want to dip your toe in, I would say probably Family Tree DNA are the best ones to test with. And this is the kind of results that you'll get. So this is my kit, and I have a cousin called Hare, who is a second cousin once removed. We've actually confirmed that. I've got another match with a guy called Haddon, who is predicted to be a distant cousin, and we share 61 centimorgans of DNA. This gives you an idea of how close the relationship is. So it gives you the known relationship, the relationship reigned. You see I've got a second to fourth cousin, second to fourth cousin. This person here has put their ancestral names in. So that allows you to see if there's any names there that you recognize from your own family tree. And it also allows you to contact them. So you click on that little icon there, the email icon, and you send them off an email saying, oh, look, we're predicted to be somewhere between second and fourth cousin. My tree is online on Ancestry, here's the link, or I can send you a little PDF or a diagram, or here's my list of surnames, does anything sound familiar? And it's about collaborating. So in the same way that you collaborate with people if you're on Ancestry or Genes Reunited or MyHeritage or any of these lines, the secret to success with DNA testing is collaboration and developing long-term relationships with your matches. So I use a stepwise approach, which I'll run through fairly quickly. There is another video that I can give you the link to where I go through it in a lot more detail, but this will give you an idea of how much work is involved. And I have to emphasize there is a lot of work involved, but it's very enjoyable. It's a great addition to your hobby, and you meet some very interesting people. You will have a lot of failures, but when you have that one success, that you will treasure that one success for the rest of your life. Step one, where does the common ancestor sit? And this is about positioning your common ancestor between you and your match on your family tree. Because it usually comes back and says, oh, your third cousins. You know, we're predicting your third cousins. Well, if that's the case, then I know that I'm down there, born about 1960. My match is around about the same age. And if we're third cousins, then we share a 2 times great-grandparent. So we're looking for somebody born about 1835. And I've got 16 great-great-grandparents. So I'm expecting to find a common name between our 2 trees at that particular generational level. And of course, you will have received the DNA from one of your great-great-grandparents, but that person will have been married to somebody, so you're looking for an ancestral couple. So that somewhat reduces your choice of what you're supposed to be looking for. If it's something like a fifth cousin, then you share a 4 times great-grandparent, and that goes back to 1765, and that's beyond my brick wall. So that's where you start looking at names on baptism records, who were the godparents, godmother, godfather, names on marriage records, who are the sponsors, because frequently godparents and sponsors will be brother or sister of the bride or groom, so you're looking for names that will give you a clue and link you to the other tree. But it is a lot of work, and the second step then is to ask, is the common ancestor obvious? You make contact, you compare trees, and that, you might say, oh look, there's the common ancestor, I see him, look, there he is in my tree, there he is in your tree. That's what you're trying to do, but a lot of the time you'll find that both of your trees end in a brick wall, and the common ancestor is maybe 1 generation above that, or 2 generations above that, so you have to become Hercule Poirot, and you have to do a lot of detective work. The third step is to eliminate non-contenders, and there's a variety of things that you can do here. If you get one of your parents tested, then if you and your father, say, both match the match, this third party, then you can say, well, it's definitely on my father's side of the family. But if you have a match that matches you, but not your father, then it has to be on your mother's side of the family. So testing yourself and a parent is very useful for excluding one side of the family. You can narrow it down to a specific common ancestral couple by testing cousins. So if you have cousins tested, and if somebody matches you and a cousin, then you know it's that particular grandparent, or that it came down through that grandparental line, and the common ancestor lies somewhere above your grandparents on that side. A match on the Y DNA and the mitochondrial DNA will tell you that it's somewhere on your direct male line or your direct female line. The X chromosome has a unique inheritance pathway, and if you have a match on the X, then that can rule out a huge number of your ancestors. So that's another technique that you can use for eliminating non-contenders. Ethnicity, nationality, and geography can be quite useful as well. If certain of your lines came from Germany, say, and certain other lines came from Jamaica, then if you match somebody who has just nothing but German lines, then you can say, well, it has to be on the German line rather than the Jamaican line. And you can also do something called phasing as well, which is quite involved, quite complex, and that would actually help you narrow down which of your grandparents the common ancestor lies above. So there's a variety of techniques that you can do, but it does get very involved. One of the tools that is freely available is GEDmatch, and you can join this website for free, and it allows you to do a lot of additional work with your DNA data that you are not able to do with any of the commercial testing companies' websites. So GEDmatch is very, very useful, and like I say, it's free, but it's slow, and there can be the occasional bug on the website, so you have to be careful how you use it. Then the last step is to work with related groups. So usually it's you get your list of matches and you contact one match, and you say, let's swap and share. The next step is to say, okay, you and I share some DNA in common with each other, but we also, there's about 5 other people that have we match on the same segment. Let's contact them and get it together in a group. So you end up round a table, almost like playing cards, and then eventually you show your hands, and hopefully you actually find that a lot of this work has been developed by the DNA adoption group in the US. You can do their course for free. No, it's $20. And they are leading the way in this more involved and complicated analysis of the DNA data. But the goal is to reconstruct a family tree for small related groups by identifying those matches you have in common with each other, looking for overlapping segments of DNA, indicating that all of you share a common ancestor somewhere in the past. Then if you do multiple 3-way comparisons and what's called triangulation, you can identify subgroups who share a common ancestor closer in time than the overall common ancestor to the entire group. Then by comparing trees, hopefully some of the smaller subgroups you can identify their common ancestors, and that might give you clues to common ancestors, to how the whole group attaches up. and by eliminating non-contenders, which was in step 3, for each of the participants in the group, that helps narrow it down even further. But it ultimately leads back to further documentary research. You still have to go back to the records. The DNA will give you some clues and say, you need to look here, but you have to go back and look at the documentary records. And then you can repeat it with those matches that you have in common, but who don't have overlapping segments. So there are levels of complexity that you can get into. So is autosomal DNA testing the best test for you? It will tell you about your ethnic makeup. If you're non-African, like deep non-African, you came out of Africa, your ancestors came out of Africa 60,000 years ago, it will tell you what percentage of Neanderthal you are. I mean, it'll be 2.5%. I can tell you that now for nothing. And it will also give you your medical risk if you test with 23andMe. It's useful for confirming a suspected relationship between two people on any ancestral line. So confirming a relationship, autosomal DNA testing could be good for doing that. It works best with close matches, usually up to about third cousins, okay, which would be a common 2 times great grandparent. It will detect 99% of first and second cousins, 90% of third cousins, 50% of fourth cousins, 10% of fifth cousins. So as you go further and further back in time, and the DNA gets more diluted and fragmented, it has less capacity and ability to detect those further matches. So it really works best with those that are fairly up close. Most of your matches will be from the US, coming back to what we said earlier about the database, because most of the people who've done the testing are US based. Fine from an Irish point of view, because there's so many Irish Americans, except they get stuck at the brick wall as well, So that is something to bear in mind. As you probably appreciated from that stepwise approach, it can get very complicated, and it's up to you how much or how little you want to get involved in that. And it certainly is very easy to get bogged down, talking from my own bitter experience. So that's autosomal DNA testing. The limitations of DNA testing: it's not a substitute for documentary research, it's just an extra tool. The cost is coming down all the time, and for your kind of standard Y DNA and mitochondrial DNA, you can get a cheap one for $49. The standard one would be more like $149. Understanding the results can be difficult because they can be sometimes too technical, and that's a complaint that we frequently get from people. And that's the need to have education and videos and mailing lists and places that you can go to ask questions. People will always be worried about privacy and data protection. There may be some legal implications, for example, adoptions, illegitimacies, so those need to be bear in mind. Most of the matches are from the US, and the different companies don't talk to each other, so one database is not shared with another database. GEDmatch kind of overcomes that because you can upload your data from any of the companies up to GEDmatch, and Family Tree DNA will allow you to upload for a price data from Ancestry Dna and from 23andMe into their database, but that'll cost you an extra $70 or so. So the best test for you depends on the question. Do you want to know more about your surname? And the blue indicates Y DNA, blue for the boys. The pink indicates mitochondrial DNA, mothers, 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 and the orange represents autosomal DNA. So if you want to know more about your surname, definitely the Y DNA test. Do you want to know about your deep ancestry? You could do the Y for your father's father's fathers, your mitochondrial for your mother's mother's mothers. Do you want to connect with distant cousins? Then the autosomal DNA test probably is the best. Do you want to break through a brick wall? Autosomal test probably. Do you want to do it just for fun? Any of them, but again, I think the autosomal gives you more value for your money. Do you want to know about your ethnic makeup? Then definitely autosomal. Do you want to know about your medical risks? Then definitely autosomal, and 23andMe is the company that offers that. So each test has its pros and cons. And those, again, to summarize, are the 4 major companies. You also have African DNA, and you've got African Ancestry, which are these specialist companies. And this is a list of... No, I think that's it. Yes, that's it. So thank you very much for your kind attention, and if there's any questions, I'd be happy to ask them.
Okay.